Well, speaking of feeling anxious, there's many forms of anxiety and there's many reasons for anxiety, including, will I be able to go ahead and make this be both educational and entertaining? I hope I'll be able to do so, but your participation is most welcome. But in terms of anxiety, though, all of that very much pales to what's very fundamental about the human condition. Or Jean-Paul Sartre said, being and nothingness. Our anxiety in the face of our humanity, our fragility, entropy, time, and the fact that no one gets out of here alive, all of which don't exactly make talking about how to take care of and protect the rights of the chronically mentally ill and fragile elderly to live in community settings. And really the subtitle should be, and how to protect those who help them to live in community settings. So to the extent that fragility of being human is fundamental in our experience, I think of protecting the right of people to live in the least restrictive alternative, of fragile people to live in the least restrictive alternative, as being absolutely fundamental to the mental health mission, to the medical mission as a whole. And one of the things which happens is that as time goes on, there is almost no medical condition that I can think of which does not have a mental health component to it. The more fragile the person is, the more the issue isn't only going to be what's their physical status, but also what's their mental status, and can they live in a less restrictive alternative to having to be institutionalized in one form or another. My subtitle here is From King Lear to New Jersey. Are all of you familiar with Shakespeare's King Lear? Has anyone not had the pleasure of watching the play, or actually watching one of the two great movies about it? Probably the greatest theater performance in English is one by Sir Laurence Olivier of King Lear, and that's easily available. The greatest film on King Lear, by the way, for those of you who are looking for something, and subtitled, is the Russian version of King Lear, where the translation from English into Russian and back into English was done by Boris Pasternak, and the movie score was done by Shostakovich. So that, in my book anyway, is the very, very best movie. It's really well worth seeing, especially if you're going to be dealing with fragile people, because with Shostakovich and Pasternak, Shakespeare really begins to shine out that much more, and how fundamental understanding fragility, what happens during fragility, and what risks are created when someone who has been in command all his life becomes fragile. It very much highlights that. So, having said that, I should mention that when we talk about King Lear, we are not violating the Goldwater rule. Is everyone familiar with that? That's the idea that we should not go ahead and give diagnoses to living politicians as mental health professionals. Again, controversial, but having said that, we also will not be violating HIPAA or any other potential impediment to us being able to think freely and talk freely here. But beyond that, I also think it sheds a little light on that particular rule, because one of the take-home messages is it's not about the diagnosis. The kinds of challenges that we face as mental health professionals and that patients and families face are generally not directly related. They can be informed by diagnosis, but diagnosis has its limitations. I mean, I use diagnoses. I've taught diagnostic interviewing for over 20 years, but It's ultimately much more, the diagnosis is a heuristic, potentially a hypothesis, it's a starting point, it's not an end point as far as problem solving is concerned, and understanding human beings deeply. Having said that, it's, it gives me particular pleasure to be able to talk about the challenges of taking care of people who are very fragile in the community here at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. I mean, this is really part of a great tradition. We had the first day hospital in the United States here. When I was a resident in the day hospital, my supervisor was Salzman, who some of you may well know. This was also, the Massachusetts Mental Health Center has also been a national and an international leader in focusing on housing for the chronically mentally ill. A former superintendent here, Miles Shaw, was absolutely foundational in creating reasonable housing for fragile, mentally ill patients. This is also a place where we pioneered guardianship for medication in the community. My co-founders in the program in psychiatry in the law town, Gutheil and Paul Appelbaum, each were very much immersed in that. And beyond that, I think Mass Mental is not only a place which can help us learn how to care regarding the fragile mentally ill, but I do believe it's just fundamentally a place which has a tremendous amount to teach medical students, mental health professionals in general, beyond simply how we take care of chronically mentally ill. In particular, with people now becoming older and physically being able to be less fragile and continue to live longer, we now have the challenge of maintaining people from suffering from a variety of dementia and depression-related impairments in the community. I don't know if you've seen this, but I surely have seen older patients now. My oldest patient was 102, and he was still seeing patients. So, and he's doing it quite well. He wanted to make sure that he was doing it quite well. So what can we learn first from King Lear, and then I'll try to get into some case experiences, forensic case experiences, on how to meet these challenges, and how a forensic psychiatric consultation can be helpful at times to meet the challenges which arise from taking care of very elderly people where there's a variety of family dynamics at play at the same time. And sometimes it's a matter of tag you're the bad guy here, because after all, if I'm in pain, I feel shame. If I feel shame, I need someone to blame. So that is very often the dynamic which drives on these higher risk cases. So, King Lear, I want to give you a very quick lightning summary with apologies to those of you who have seen it more than 5 times. I've only seen it about 7 times now, but I'm still learning from it, so please accept my apologies if you've seen it. King Lear is the aging king of Britain. He decides to step down from his throne and divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters. But why he does it is complicated. Maybe he wants peace amongst them. At least this becomes a revenge of unintended consequences, right? He wants peace, so he splits England up. However, he puts his daughters through a test first, asking, hey, listen, I need something from you. I need you to tell me how much you love me. Now, is that unusual? No, it's not. One of our antidotes to the angst that mortality brings with it is we want to be well remembered and we want to be well appreciated. So very often, people will either be explicit, as King Lear is, or implicit in making the demand upon their kids. Even if it's unspoken, or even if it's unspeakable, it doesn't mean that this is not something which becomes part of the family contract. Show me how much you love me, and perhaps as a less narcissistic corollary, tell me how you will remember me, which I think is all too often overlooked. I mean, it's easy to go ahead and say, well, this is just some narcissistic pathological trait. It doesn't have to be necessary. So here the three daughters have been depicted over time, not only by Shakespeare, but by painter after painter after painter. We have the two older daughters, Gutheil and Regan, who gave their dad very flattering answers. But Cordelia gets choked up, basically. And she says that she cannot bring her heart to her mouth to describe how much she loves her father, which is it's not an unusual position by a loving child. But then she says something which gets Leo pretty angry, but he's not yet flying off the handle when she finally says the unspeakable. Whereas her sisters say, "Oh, my heart belongs to Daddy," she says, I'll give half my heart to Daddy and half my heart to my husband, my husband to me. And that gets Leo, hey, wait a minute, what do you mean here? How dare you? What happens next is that very quickly, even Leo goes ahead and gives half his kingdom to Gutheil, half his kingdom to Regan. Cordelia gets exiled, although fortunately the King of France marries Cordelia anyway, dowry or no dowry. He says, that's okay, I've had enough, and they go off to France. But what happens to Leo is he gets kicked. He wants to spend half his time with Gutheil, the oldest daughter, and half his time with Regan, the youngest daughter. But guess what? Each one, and he doesn't behave quite well. He still is acting like a crotchety old king. And when he starts spending time with each daughter, they had enough. They say, wait a minute, you're not the king anymore. I'm the queen of this castle. And he gets kicked out from one to the other, and out they go. And they rationalize it. But again, these are not unreasonable responses by kids who have had enough of daddy here. But what happens at the same time, is that Cordelia finds out her daddy's being mistreated. So she says to the King of France, hey, honey, can you give me an army? And she brings the army over to England to go ahead and save her father from betrayal. But bad things happen to good people. Her army is defeated, she is captured, Leo is captured, and then her bad, mean sisters, for now, decide that, we'll do what Elizabeth did to Mary of Scots, except here Cordelia gets hanged surreptitiously. Leo finds out about it, and he dies from a broken heart. But before he does, there's a very, very touching scene where Cordelia tries to comfort her father in prison before she's executed. And this is from William Blake, which shows that from her point of view, it wasn't that she was holding back because she didn't love her father. She was holding back because she wanted to be truthful. And her idea of expressing truth was to go ahead and to say what she said and not say what she didn't say. By the way, the bad sisters get it at the end, so that's the good news. But be it as it may, if we were to think about it from a mental health point of view, first of all, can Leo live in the community? Should he be categorized as being psychotic, psychopathic, depressed, or demented? Well, when you look at the complexity of the play, the answer is it just doesn't work. And the diagnosis can be helpful, but if we look at the limitations of the DSM-5, for example, it's not going to go ahead and answer those questions in any meaningful way. What are the limits of the DSM as applied to someone like King Lear? First of all, while the DSM-4 had one diagnosis, which talked about the relational disorder, there was folie à deux, shared delusional disorder. The DSM-5 decided it doesn't need it anymore. It's been eliminated. At the same time, so what we have in the DSM-5 is something which is individualistic and monistic. Whereas here, in order to be able to make an assessment of what's best for King Lear, you really need to assess the dynamics of his relationships with his three daughters, which the DSM-5 does not give us any tools for. It also, even if we see him as being somewhat psychotic or in a psychotic rage, perhaps, what it misses is any sense of context and affect sensitivity. Because when Leo is not in a psychotic rage or in a rage, he clearly is not psychotic. He actually can be quite rational. And the rest of the play shows there's points in time that he is actually incredibly far more rational than many of than his daughters. So again, the idea of what's rational and what's not doesn't quite wash. What does Leo show from a risk management point of view? One of them is that the good intentions may indeed be a way to that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as goes the old truism. Very true. Remember, Leo divides the kingdom among his daughters, supposedly to avoid strife. Now, I should mention, by the way, as for those of you who are real Shakespeare fans, that this was the play which King James, the Scottish king, the Stuart king, commissioned of Shakespeare after Queen Elizabeth died. And one understanding is that Shakespeare, having seen enough of the civil wars during Elizabeth's time, and subsequently decided with Mary that the one message she wanted to give this king is don't divide up the kingdom, because even if you think it's going to lead to peace, trust me, no one will come out ahead if you do that. Another way of understanding it is that Leo's wish to divide the kingdom to be at peace is a way to avoid internal conflict, his own internal conflict. So he's going to divide things up externally. Having said that, there's another way of interpreting it, again, without being judgmental about it, is that there's a wish for omnipotence and omnipresence, the visible hand beyond the grave. But having said that, again, should we be really so judgmental of King Lear, or should we go ahead and say that he is, in fact, just a simple narcissist? When another way of understanding it is, look, I mean, who doesn't want to be well remembered as they're dying? I mean, in fact, one of the things we can often give out to dying patients is the idea, I'm going to remember you, and I'm going to remember you well. So, again, it's simply focuses on how much complexity there is. So I'm going to, while not giving answers to questions, Leo also raises the kinds of questions that we see from a risk management point of view. And very often, from a risk management point of view, in addition to living, is this person able to live in the community? As people get older, the next question is also, is there a diminution in capacity, in testamentary capacity? What about undue and due influence? And there's been more than one world contest where I've seen where the angry siblings who get dispossessed by someone who's being treated by a psychiatrist get mad at the psychiatrist. Or get mad at the psychologist, or get mad at the neurologist, or the internist who's treating the person, saying, look, our dad was obviously incompetent and you didn't go ahead and file a guardianship in time. Shame on you, one way or the other. And also, even though there's, generally speaking, there was not third-party litigation that blooms from this, mental health providers, physicians, can be dragged into very, very mean and nasty contests, with one side or another proceeding to then demonize the healthcare provider. Of course, one way of avoiding that is saying, look, my focus was basically on helping this person with their suffering. I wasn't there to do a forensic evaluation. Another way is to go ahead and to seek a consultation on that point. So, what about forensic cases? Even though these cases are in the public domain, because they're forensic cases, there's a case name for them, you can go into the legal records and find who this person is, I'm still going to de-identify them, because I find that it allows one to speak much more freely with the identification. The first case which I would like us to think about is how do we protect the right of someone who is chronically mentally ill, who's had a series of hospitalizations to live in the community? How can we go ahead and do that? And I call this the case of Josie Jane. It happened in New Jersey, which a lot of things happen in New Jersey, but it's one of them. Her mother was very concerned about her chronically mentally ill daughter because she was at times between hospitalizations sleeping in automobiles. She also had refused halfway houses at times. So what's her mom to do? She bought her a condo. And she lived in a very nice condo complex. Her condominium was insured. Even one day, she fell asleep and accidentally began a fire in the condo. And up went the condo, but not only did her condo go up in flames, but the whole condo complex went up in flames. Probably built by some great construction company, but it happened. But New Jersey's a funny place, as I said, when it comes to construction especially. So the whole place goes up in flames. You know, no one gets hurt. That's the good news about it. Slow move. So, but the mother's insurance company is willing to pay for that condo. It's an accidental fire. I mean, police investigate. There's no evidence of a fire setting, no evidence of an accelerant. But most of the other people in the condominium are insured by another insurance company. And that insurance company is going to go ahead and take a huge hit because this is a whole condo complex that they're insuring. So what does the insurance company, which is going to take a huge hit, do? It winds up suing the mother's insurance company. And the mother, but basically, they know the mother wasn't going to pony up for millions and millions and millions of dollars. But they sue her and her insurance company, saying that the mother had no right to buy that condo, and that basically Josie Jane's actions, even though accidental, were foreseeable because she was chronically mentally ill, and she had been bounced back and forth from hospitals. And she had had other accidents previously, because when she gets psychotic, she stops caring for herself, basically. So, at that point, I was asked to review and analyze the medical and legal records relative to plaintiff's claims that Jane's mother should have foreseen and prevented Jane accidentally causing the fire, and basically that Jane's mother's insurance company was on the hook for tens of millions at this point. Which is interesting, I mean, because remember, the other condos are not paying health premiums, they're paying premiums to their insurance company, but their insurance company wants to do a little risk shifting. I did a review and analysis of her voluminous medical records. She herself was not available for evaluations. I didn't examine her. I also did a review and analysis of the psychiatrist who had been hired by the Condo Owners Association insurance company, basically, who said, yes, Mom was responsible. Mom should have never allowed her to live in the community, and basically Mom's insurance company should pay. From what I could see, there was no methodology behind it. There was no attempt to consider alternative hypotheses, such as the fact that there was no mental health provider that she had seen who felt that she could not live in the community in the past year or so. I mean, she did have some contact with mental health providers. So how could a lay person, her mom, foresee and that there would be an accident here and she could not live in the community when her mental health providers could not? And my thought was a reasonable evaluation had been done. In addition to her illness, she had considerable strengths and resilience, and she did have periods of decompensation. But having said that, it did not make her ineligible for living in the community. The presiding judge, based on my affidavit, dismissed the claims of the condo association insurance company, and the insurance company had to pay, but he didn't like it. So they appealed to the New Jersey State Supreme Court. And here's the appellate ruling, which is so much in the public domain that I have no compunction about at this point, sharing it with you. What the appellate ruling says is that the plaintiffs failed to demonstrate the defendant had sufficient knowledge to impose such a duty, such as not to allow her to live in the community. And although Josie Jane was clearly suffering from mental illness, several psychiatric hospitals released her without finding she posed a danger to herself, others, or any property. As the motion judge, as the presiding judge, emphasized, no qualified professional told the defendant or anyone else that Josie Jane could not live alone, that she was a danger to herself, or that the accident which would be so devastatingly terrible. Further, we are not persuaded that the defendant could reasonably foresee that her daughter would cause damage to her neighbor's property. Plaintiff's reference to Josie Jane repeatedly damaging her own property. For example, she wouldn't do the cleaning for it at times. Failed to convince us that it was foreseeable that she would set a fire, or that she would even accidentally set a fire which would damage adjoining units. The record contained no indication that Josie Jane ever damaged another's property or set fire to her condominium prior to the incident. Accordingly, we find no basis to impose a duty of care on the defendant. And that's a major victory of families who want to go ahead and support their kids to be able to live in the community when the kids refuse to live in a halfway house. And the alternative would be chronic institutionalization with people who cannot live in the community. It was also, I think, ultimately very protective of the various hospitals and caregivers who used their best judgment and who could not foresee that she would go ahead and set a fire, which destroyed a large number of condominiums. Part of my evaluation was also to look at her pattern of behavior. There was no evidence of psychopathy here. This wasn't just someone who was hypomanic and psychopathic. I don't give a damn about anyone else. I'm going to go ahead and, when I'm hypomanic, drink, drug, and drive, for example. If you have a pattern like that, that's a somewhat different issue. There was nothing like that here. So here, it wasn't just a diagnosis of her being bipolar, which would make a difference. It was vital to go ahead and have a more deeper and fuller understanding of who Josie Jane was. And ultimately, it's vital to go ahead and make the distinction between, again, the primary diagnosis and the secondary diagnosis and the level of impairment. And the focus, my focus, was what was her level of impairment. And her level of impairment, yes, she had periods of serious impairment, but was it foreseeable that even during those periods she would go ahead and hurt herself, hurt anyone else, or damage anyone else's property? No. I mean, she had periods of time when she threw dishes, for example, but was she ever hurt anyone? No. Was there a substance abuse problem which complicated the picture on a chronic basis? No. So those are some of the factors which allowed, I think, the appellate court to quite rightly dismiss the case against her mother. Now, what about the elderly? How does this generalize to the elderly? The elderly themselves, the more fragile they become, the more they depend on other people, can be subject to undue influence. The more their capacity is diminished, the more there is a potential for undue influence. This is a case which I call Texas Ted. That's the state in which it occurred. And he was a billionaire whose third wife prevented his children and grandchildren from the first two marriages from contacting him over the 2 or 3 years that he slowly slid into dementia. Now, was that by itself enough for undue influence? No. Was that itself enough for the diminished testamentary capacity? No. But and was his diagnosis of Alzheimer's itself sufficient for his being impaired, relative, and being unduly influenceable? No. There were some other factors involved. One of them was that his third wife decided that the stepsister was dying in his last year from cancer. What he really needed to do was to engage in immersive therapy, where she had one of her friends who was a so-called immersive therapist, an expressive therapist, came to his home and had him talk about how angry he was with his children, 24/7, that was going to be his therapy as he was dying. A very interesting form of therapy for someone who's dying, but never. Human beings are how to both underestimate and overestimate, I suppose. So there was that. There was the fact that his treating neurologist, who was testifying for this testifying expert, retained by his third wife, his treating neurologist had a little bit of a conflict of interest. His wife's sister was his medical partner. So maybe there's a tiny bit of conflict of interest there. And also, the money which was going to be left primarily to his third wife, but also to a university, which happened to be the university which the treating neurologist was very much a part of. But beyond even that, the treating neurologist did nothing to evaluate whether or not what the relationship was. Was there any undue influence or not, potentially, in that context, in that relationship? He also disregarded what data there was about his actual impairment. He had one of the lowest MOCAs, MOCA, Montreal Cognitive Assessment Inventory I've ever seen. He clearly, it wasn't just that his memory was impaired, his executive functions were absolutely impaired. But that didn't matter to him, because when I saw him with his wife, he seemed okay. Eventually what happened was the case went to the jury, and the jury, after its due deliberation, decided not only that the new expressive therapy-based will was invalid, that he had been unduly influenced, and that legal costs were going to be borne by his third wife, which is very unusual in these contests. Usually, each side has a perspective on it. But in this particular instance, it was really quite clear that there was more than one way to view things, but there was also a very wrong way to view things. Does that mean that any decisions made by the elderly are therefore, or by fragile mentally ill, are therefore suspect and a priori to be considered incompetent or unduly influenced? The clear answer is no. So this is a case where the claim of undue influence was really being used to harass an elderly man in his early 90s who wanted to marry his high school sweetheart, also in her early 90s. They both were relatively intact. He wanted to marry her and to live the last years of his life with her. They had been high school sweethearts. They kept in touch during reunions. Her marriage was happy, but she was widowed. His marriage was unhappy, but he was widowed. So he wanted to go ahead and since they came from a very traditional background, he said, she said, look, if we're going to be living together, he said, oh yeah, then let's get married. So they decided to get married. The kids, his kids, not her kids, but his kids said, wait a minute, Daddy's not writing us checks anymore. He's not living with her. Shame on him. He must be incompetent. So they went to his doctor, who's a very good internist, a superb internist. Her doctor had psychiatry, even though he was an internist, he was very much mindful of the biopsychosocial model, had a good deal of psychiatry training. He said, no, your dad's not incompetent. I mean, it's true that he suffers from some conditions which cardiovascular condition. The guy used to play football, so he has some degree of concussive traumatic encephalopathy, so he has rigidity and fine motor coordination problems, but he's not incompetent. So they said, well, we want to go ahead and file a petition for guardianship. So his lawyer said, no, and wait a minute, you can't do that. Yes, we can. Okay, so he went to the family physician, and the family physician filed a petition saying that he does not need guardianship with the court. What do the kids do? They go ahead and find, are you any neuropsychologists here by any chance? Because I've never seen this actually happen. They find some neuropsychologists who's in a very private practice, in a very part of the state where I have this, and without even examining him, she files a guardianship petition saying he needs guardianship. Now, the idea of actually filing such a petition before you examine the person, it really boggles the imagination. Unfortunately, there's a judge who's very sensitive to protect, unfortunately, I suppose, to protect the rights of the elderly. So he says, well, I don't know what to do now. At that point, she said, well, I'm going to go ahead and do an examination. Each side can go ahead and have him be examined. So the neuropsychologist went and examined him, and guess what? She found that he was incompetent. And among her bases for incompetence was she asked him to draw a clock. And he had a great deal of difficulty drawing that clock, the truth be known. I come to see him. It turns out he's really difficult small motor coordination, but you show him an actual clock, he'll tell you what time it is. He can go ahead and point to where it is, but you ask him to draw it, he'll do a terrible drawing of a clock. So the limitations of a clock is. As far as his memory limitations, it's true that after 5 minutes, he has a difficult time retrieving what was shown to him. But as far as recognition is concerned, he's 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5. So if you go ahead and ask him to recognize that he can do, retrieval is difficult. Does he know his property? Yes, he knows his property. Is he able to go ahead and plan ahead during the exam? He was planning ahead. As far as undue influence was concerned, it was clear that Massachusetts Milton, who you remember was a judge, he was the guy who was in charge. He was telling his wife what to do, basically, when I saw the two of them. He was ordering, can you go ahead and make sure I have some coffee before this exam? I really want to go ahead and be able to, she was playing the clerk and he was being the judge, basically. So the idea of who's unduly influencing who here was just nonsense. So, at that particular point, what we had was something which I've called critogenesis, which is the use of the legal system to basically harass someone. And that's what was happening there. Now, I should say that it's not always the elderly who are the ones who actually are subject to undue influence. It can go in the other direction. A recent case I had in Massachusetts again was where a mother had a very substance-abusing adolescent. And that substance-abusing adolescent happened to be the favorite of her grandparents. So what happens is grandparents leave the house to the substance-abusing adolescents. Mother says, oh, okay, you have difficulty. She did at that time. So therefore, you have to sign over the house to me. No question. There's other mechanisms which can be used, such as a conservatorship, for example, to make sure that this would. So the kid says, okay, Mom, anything you tell me. A 15-year-old, I'll go ahead and do so. Signs over the house. 15 years later, the adolescent is now doing very, very well as a young woman. She has a child, she's married, she's a respectable child. And she says, I really didn't know what I was doing when I signed over this the house to mom. At that point, again, I'm asked as a forensic psychiatrist, because she's a senior mental health provider who referred it to me, say, well, could you do an evaluation? My evaluation basically consisted of the fact that at this point in time, the daughter was a reliable historian. She was not making up. She was not being psychopathic. She had basically, and she was competent at this point to go ahead and proceed with her case, saying that she had been unduly influenced. The judge saw it that way, and she got her house back. She signed over 15 years later. So that's a sense of what do we do what do I do as a forensic psychiatrist when I'm asked to go ahead and consult on cases where there was an issue of impairment, there was an issue of capacity, there was an issue of undue influence, because often those three will go hand in hand. As I said, it's simply not confined to just mental health cases by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, what we see now is that the older that people get, the more these questions arise. So having said that, where does that leave us? I'd like to think that leaves us first thinking about maxims such as the one by Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was a philosopher in the 20th century. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him, but he has always been a perennial favorite of mine, and has informed my own thinking as much as anyone else. If in the midst of life we are in death, so in sanity we are surrounded by madness. And the more life there is, the more we get closer to the undiscovered country, the less often there is sanity, but it's not necessarily the person who is dying. And the more we are surrounded by madness, which the madness is not just the person necessarily, but there can also be those who have had relationships with him, and for whatever reason, simply cannot let go. But having said all that, it's also useful to remember when evaluating these cases, Freud's maxim, human beings are capable of both far better and far worse than we can imagine. Thanks so much.